Good morning, my dear friends. I hope you're all doing very well. Today we're going to be learning chapter 20 in the laws of Shabbat of the Rambam of Maimonides. So today we're going to be learning all about work, carrying, that our animals should not do on Shabbat. So there is a mitzvah in the Torah that we're not allowed to work on Shabbat, as we have already learned over the last 19 chapters before this. But now we're going to be learning about the next part of the mitzvah of Shabbat, which is where it says in the verse that on the seventh day on Shabbat, you shall cease activity. And then it continues on by saying, and thus your ox and your donkey may rest as well. So in other words, that all our animals, whatever it is, whether it's a donkey, whether it's an ox, which includes all the different types of animals that we might have or come in contact with, they should not do any work for us on Shabbat. So, this is a mitzvah which the Torah spells out that we should do, and therefore we are not allowed that our animals should work for us on Shabbat. How does this work? So the Rambam comes by and says as follows: our animals are not allowed to carry for us in a public domain. So if we have a public domain, we are in the middle of traveling. When it comes to Shabbat, we can't say, my things will be on the animal, and I will continue traveling, and my animal will continue carrying all my stuff. Back in the day, that's the way they used to travel. They would put all their stuff onto their donkeys, and they would travel. So, we're not allowed to travel on Shabbat, but that's a different discussion. But even just to take something from one place to another, we're not allowed to have our animal do that for us on Shabbat. Not only that, we're also not allowed, and this is clearly as a forbidden, a negative commandment. The Torah says that our animal is not allowed to work. It says that you should not work on Shabbat, and it continues spelling out you, your son, your daughter, your servant, your maidservant, and your animals. That we're not allowed to have our animals do actual work, plowing the fields, and so on Shabbat. So much so, this is such a strong and stringent law that our animals are not allowed to work for us on Shabbat, and they have to rest, just like we are commanded to rest on Shabbat. The verse includes it together. You, your family, and your animals. So the Rambam continues on by saying that it's so much so that therefore we are not allowed to lease or let or lend or hire our animal to a non-Jew over Shabbat, because he might use your animal on Shabbat and use it for working, and our animal is commanded to rest on Shabbat. So even though the animal is not doing any work for yourself, it's working for someone else. You're just lending it to your neighbor. Still, your animal right now belongs to you. You are not allowed to have that animal work on Shabbat. And therefore, you should not lend it to someone who is not keeping Shabbat through the duration of Shabbat. So it's a very interesting law. And so that's the idea over here. But then the Rambam says, but in regards to a horse, for instance, a horse is not usually used as an animal to carry loads on it, to put heavy weight, but rather a horse is usually for people to ride on them. They're transporting humans rather than burdens. And a human, as we have learned already, a human is a living entity, and a living entity carries itself. So since a human carries themselves, so to speak, we are alive. So therefore it is not counted that the horse is transporting us, although, obviously the animal is, but transporting a human is different than transporting just an object. And therefore a horse would be allowed, but a donkey, let's say, would not. If we're going to, it's very interesting that this highlight of this law, so much so that we find that even in regards to selling our animals, there are laws in regards that in regards to the idea of selling our animals to a non-Jew, lest he work with them on Shabbat. because technically speaking, it doesn't belong to us anymore. But since this animal belonged to us, there is an idea that the animal should not work on Shabbat. So if we're selling it to a non-Jew just to slaughter or so on for meat, that's one thing. But for it to work, so then that's already there is discussion in Jewish law if it's something which is allowed or not. So today, generally speaking, it's not a problem. The rabbis throughout the history have come to a decision that selling animals is fine, but to have your own animal to be rented out and for someone to be using it on Shabbat, that's something which is not allowed. And when it comes to a flock, sheep, goats, and so on, which are not really animals that are working and carrying weight and so on. So then it depends really on the area, on how these animals are used and so on. So it would depend on the situation. How about if a person is going on a trip? And now it's coming to Shabbat and he doesn't have anywhere to go and he has his bag of money and he has his animal. And he wants to put his money on the animal so that it should carry it for him. So the Rambam says that there's a very interesting way that he's allowed to do this. It's like a loophole, so to speak, in the law, where a person is allowed to put it down. The animal is walking, and you put down your money on the animal. And then the animal continues walking, and once it stops, you pull it off before it actually comes to a complete stop. And what happens then is that the animal is not, if you remember, we spoke about this earlier on when we were discussing the laws of carrying, the main bulk of the laws of carrying, that there has to be two parts to the carrying. There has to be the lifting up of the object, the carrying it, and then putting it down. So there is lifting it and putting it down. Two important parts. And if the person doesn't do both of these parts, well then they are not liable. So for instance, if a person passes something, someone takes something and the other person takes it out of their hand, so you're not the one putting it down, then you wouldn't be liable for transferring, for carrying. Similar case over here. The animal has to start walking with the item on its back, continue walking, and then stop and essentially putting it down. So the animal is lifting it, walking, and putting it down. If the animal doesn't do all of that, but rather it's walking and you just put it down, or you put it down and the animal starts walking, but then before it stops you take it off, well then the animal didn't do the entire work, so to speak. You've split it up. I did half, the animal did half. In such a case, that is the loophole, so to speak, in how a person would be able to do that. But obviously, this is not something which should be done, generally speaking, only in a case where there is no other option. But if a person, for instance, has a non-Jew who is traveling with them, well then they're allowed to give it to them to carry for them. That's fine. If we have a child, is the child allowed to do things which are forbidden on Shabbat? A Jewish child. So the Rambam says that generally speaking, we should not ask, from a child or anyone who doesn't have the full capability of understanding to do this on Shabbat, to do any work for us on Shabbat, and therefore, worst case scenario, a person should just, if he has to move something, if it's whatever it is, so then they should just move it a little bit, less than 4 cubits, as we've spoken about, which is the way that a person is allowed to move something slowly across. A person should not pull an animal by its reins or its bridle on Shabbat, unless it's the appropriate rein or the leash, so to speak, for this animal. So in other words, a person shouldn't walk a cat with a muzzle. That's not the appropriate string for it. It's not the appropriate way of taking it. and so on and so forth for all the different animals. Because essentially, if it's not the right one, well, then what happens is you're actually carrying the string not for the purpose of the animal, because the animal doesn't need it. So therefore, you shouldn't do that. So too also, a person should not take donkeys, many donkeys connected to one another, and lead them on Shabbat, because it seems that he's going to sell them in the marketplace. And that's obviously not allowed to do on Shabbat. So therefore, a person is not allowed to do that. But if it's one donkey, and it's with the correct string, with the correct reins, that would be allowed. And then the Rambam goes and talks about various animals, what they are allowed to go out into the open, into the public domain on Shabbat with, and what they are not allowed to go. So for instance, he says chickens are not allowed to go with cords or straps tied to their feet. Sheep should not go out with little pieces of wood, little pieces of sticks that are stuck into their nose, so that they should. It's an interesting law, this, that they shouldn't sneeze and then dislodge the worms in their brains. It's an interesting law, but or a calf should not go out with a small yoke that is placed on its neck to accustom it to start wearing a yoke later. All of these things that are, so to speak, extra in a certain level, they're not for its basic essential need, that should not be done on Shabbat. For instance, an animal, if you have like an animal that has a saddle, there's no need for the saddle, because you should not be riding the animal on Shabbat. So you should not go out with an animal wearing a saddle. But if it's, for instance, an animal that broke its leg and now you have some sort of bandage or band-aid, something to help the animal to become healthy again, well, that would be allowed. So on and so forth. So that's in regards to animals, what animals are allowed, what animals are not allowed to do on Shabbat. Now in regards to a person's servants, maidservants, people that are working for them. So if you have a person that's working for you on Shabbat, so there are different levels of working. So there's a servant who is more of a permanent servant, someone who maybe lives in your house. Then there are people that are just hired, that are working for you, but they go back to their own house and they live their own lives. So the bottom line is that they are not allowed to work for us on Shabbat, to do things that are not allowed to be done on Shabbat, generally speaking. So a servant or a maidservant, definitely the Torah clearly spells out that everything that you have, whether it's an animal, whether it's your children, whether it's a servant, whether it's a foreigner who is living in Israel and is taking upon themselves to keep the laws of the Jewish people, all of these should not be working for a Jew on Shabbat. Even though this person who is just this foreigner who is living in Israel, technically they are in their own lives. They're allowed to do whatever they want. They don't have to keep Shabbat. They're not Jewish. But to work for a Jew on Shabbat is something which they shouldn't do. But if we're talking about someone who is just living their own lives, we're talking about we're here in the United States, people who are just living their own lives. It's not that they have any connection to us. It's not that they are taking upon themselves any mitzvahs, any commandments, like the foreigner who lives in Israel, which over there there's a 7 Noahide laws, which is important that they keep, and so on and so forth. Over here, if you want someone to do a certain work, to do a certain work on Shabbat, there is more leniencies in regards to the way to have it be done in a permissible form. But that is, generally speaking, that ourselves we have to rest on Shabbat, our family and children should rest on Shabbat, our servants and maidservants, all the way down to our animals as well. Everyone should be resting on Shabbat. It's the day of rest for all of the Jewish people and everything that surrounds their lives. So that is the chapter for today. Hope you enjoyed it. We're going to continue tomorrow, God willing, with the next chapter as we continue shrugging through the laws of Shabbat. We'll see you all. Have a very good day in the meantime.